Chavez, Field CISO for Mainline Information Systems. Today we're going to focus specifically on inventory of apps and data. Let's get into it. We really have to embrace that legacy architecture where we ran a lot of our applications on-prem and centralized infrastructure just doesn't exist today. The business has moved their most prevalent workloads out into the cloud, software as a service, platform as a service. So by monitoring that user behavior, interrogating those endpoints, watching the network, the ports, protocols that are being leveraged, it gives us a tremendous amount of information that we can start to dig into and identify the underlying applications that these users are running. Let's talk a little bit about the data. How do we identify all of our data, do the inventory? How do we classify it? How do we validate it? How do we ultimately treat our data like an asset so that we better understand how we need to protect it, when we need to dispose of it? And just like our apps and our assets, when it comes to the data, it all starts with inventory. And again, what's important when we're doing the inventory of our data is that we find all the data. We want to search the global catalogs of the data throughout our organization. We want to start to identify who are the owners of this data and how are they consuming it. Then we're ready to start to get into the classification of our data. Now, during this classification phase, what's really important is that we dig deeper than the traditional classification models of confidential, internal, public. We really got to start to try to put business context on this data. What's accounting? What's finance? What's HR? And to go a step further, what's HR workman's comp versus HR employee grievances versus HR onboarding agreements, HR insurance claims? All of these things could be stored as confidential, but in the enterprise, we often see different groups, departments, sub-departments, where the access to this data does not overlap. And this is critical to enabling us to understand how we build our controls to maximize their effectiveness when it comes to the access of that data on an ongoing basis. Now we can start to get in and really validate our data. We uncover access violations associated with the management policies of different types of data in our organization, ensuring that access to sensitive data is aligned with need to know, assessing our privileged accounts and how they're accessing and leverage data repositories, confirming if terminated user accounts still have access to different data sets, which is very common. We uncover a lot in organizations. Finding sensitive data that may be stored in public or internal shared locations. Identifying data that may be shared with external parties or third-party organizations that we're engaged with. Hopefully, we're identifying, prioritizing, and remediating access risk across our data in the organization. And now, we're ready to get into some of the fun stuff. And unfortunately, what we tend to find is this is where a lot of people will start at the protect phase. Now, the protect phase involves things like enhancing our data loss prevention solution, our cloud app security solutions. So let's pause for a second and think about that. If you're going through a data governance, data protection project, and you're starting with your DLP or your cloud app security, or maybe it's your cyber recovery solution, but you have not gone through the process to inventory, to classify, to validate, we don't have the insight we need to properly configure these controls. Some other things that come out of the protect phase is enhancing our disaster recovery and our data protection capabilities, greatly improving our threat detection and incident response processes because we now know the data that's most important to us and how we need to protect it. We can identify those deviations from approved policies. We're able to validate that our sensitive data is stored in the right locations and potentially even introduce automation to start to ensure that that data does not drift and deviate out of those locations. We can really have confidence that our data is being protected properly, like by our security controls with things like encryption, maybe our firewall policy, because we're trying to build zero trust. And going back to that HR scenario, if we built the policy at HR, we miss that HR internal and HR workman's comp and HR onboarding agreements are different groups and different users, and they never overlap, right? Again, we really start to build on the cyber control investments that we see in the marketplace today. Now we start to get into the respond phase. During the respond phase, we really start to put heavy focus on things like data governance and our ongoing compliance needs associated with our data. How do we make our ongoing audit and compliance process as easy as possible? How do we significantly reduce the overhead associated with things like DSARS requests or FOIA requests that our organizations are getting that really require us to have an understanding of our data? Where is it? How do we access it? How do we correlate it? How do we automate those types of processes? Significantly reducing burden and soft costs associated with internal resources of our organization. From here, we start to get into the retain phase. The retain phase really starts to benefit us when it comes to things like records management, identifying different types of files that are associated with specific record types, confirming the retention requirements associated with master records versus duplicate records, identifying records that are expired or coming close to expiration, where we need to have strong processes in order to execute on cleaning this data up. The retain phase ultimately helps us greatly improve our records management processes. And now we're ready to start to get into the purge phase. Now, the purge phase is really about data minimization. Okay, actually making sure we have the processes to go in and delete those expired records, which could lead to a significant reduction in storage and the costs associated with the ongoing retention of this data. Defensible disposal of expired data or abandoned data, which we're seeing more and more of in organizations. So this is a good representation of the entire data lifecycle. I feel like it's one of the best consolidated views of everything that goes into the full data lifecycle, right? But the thing I want to emphasize, again, bringing it all back, is that if we don't have that full inventory, we're going to be in trouble. It's what we don't know that can often hurt us the most, right? So let's make sure that as we're going through building our data resiliency, data governance programs, understanding how we ultimately best support our business and how they're leveraging and using and how long they need to retain data, inventory is really where we got to start. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your time. Have a good one.